Hi, I'm Brian Compton, lead pastor at Hillcrest Church. Thank you for joining us on this talk today. We're talking today about something very important, and that is how to navigate a crisis. We walk through stressful situations in life, and some of them are even more stressful than others. And I want you to know what you might need to do and things to keep in mind when you're going through a situation like that, and also how your church is here to help and support you through it. So we've actually put together teaching notes for you that kind of will help you guide through this. And we want to make that available to you. It's always available here at the church, but you should be able to download this as well. I want to start our talk today by asking you if you've experienced anything stressful lately. Think back to the last stressful event that you experienced. So for myself, just to give you a contrast, when during the pandemic, I worked at the ER at St. Michael's Medical Center for 2 years. And while I was there, I worked as a tech. And so I would work with the doctors and the nurses, and I would make sure that all the rooms were prepped and ready to go for any patient care. And I got to help and assist with some pretty big medical needs when people were experiencing some really serious situations. One such serious situation was when someone was having a heart attack. They would come in, and we had a code, and that meant everyone needed to drop everything and go to this situation. And I had a role to play in it. I needed to get vital signs and get an EKG going and help the nurses with other things that were needed. And so the first of these that I ever did, to me, it was chaos. It was just like you see on TV. There's all these people talking over each other, and they all hear each other, and they know what to do. This is a timed thing because, again, someone is having a heart attack, and we need to get them prepped and then down to the surgery room so that they can be saved. So this was life or death. And I was feeling it, that first one. I was trying to do my job. I'm leaning over the person, and there's the patient, and then there's nurses and doctors working all around. There's all kinds of beeping, constant beeping when you're in the ER. But in these rooms especially, it was crazy. And I remember the doctor kept asking for something, and I was like, I wonder who's going to do that. Then I realized he's asking me. It was my job, and I wasn't doing it because I just wasn't processing what was going on in the moment. It was so crazy. The person ended up being okay. Later, I was involved in another of the exact same kind of code, and this doctor was just as cool, calm, and collected as you could imagine. And we actually did the code faster than the first one I was a part of, and I remember just thinking to myself, this is almost easy. Again, the doctor was super calm. He would ask for things very clearly. He would make sure you heard him. He would get what he needed. I knew my job, the nurses knew their job, and everyone just kind of worked super cohesively, got the patient off to surgery, they were taken care of. And I remember thinking and saying to a nurse, was that just like the calmest STEMI that we've ever experienced? And they were like, yeah, this doctor's really great. And I realized it was a super stressful situation. The difference, though, there was two big differences. The first difference was the second doctor recognized the patient's crisis was not his crisis. So he was able to keep a clear mind and do his job and do it very effectively. The first experience, the first code that I was a part of, it wasn't that the doctor wasn't doing a good job. It's that I was in crisis. I didn't realize that the patient's crisis was not my crisis. I was super stressed out about it. I was nervous about doing my job. I wasn't hearing very well. I was missing things I should have been seeing. And it's because I was so stressed out. That kind of stuff happens to us all the time. And I call it crisis mode. We get into it. So at the beginning, I want to make sure we're on the same page. What is a crisis? When I say the word crisis, what does that mean to you? In the most simple of terms, a crisis is a disruption to your normal life. For example, it's usually loss related, meaning you might lose a loved one, a friend or a family member. You might lose something affecting your health or the health of a friend or a family member. It could be a relational loss, a breakup, a divorce, a friend moves away, you get redeployed. It could have to do with loss of something in your job or your career. It could be a dream that you really desperately loved and clung to, and you recognize this isn't happening the way I expected it to happen. It could be a financial loss. Of course, we all understand financial setbacks. You could have been in an accident. You might have been accused of something. You might have legal problems that have come your way. It might have to do with your house or your housing situation. You find out that your landlord is selling, or you can't afford the home you're in, or whatever it is. Those kinds of things would constitute a crisis in us. They do things within us that affect us and how we see the world around us. Now, the truth is, most of us think that we're better at navigating a crisis than we really are. And I make that observation from 25 years in ministry, working as a pastor and working as a chaplain in our community. I would go on record to say most people think they're better at navigating a crisis than they really are. So, crises are like trials. They give us the opportunity to grow and to mature. If we take the opportunity, we can mature in ourselves, we can mature in our relationships, and we can even mature in our depth and trust of Jesus and our faith. But one of the most significant roadblocks to us viewing crisis as opportunities to mature is that we don't realize how much our bodies are affected by crisis. And most of us have learned to ignore our body's messages. Now, I say that because in the last 6 years, I've lost 2 family members, and both times I experienced very deep grief. The first one, I had no idea what was happening. I had experienced it with other people, but never in myself. And I had no understanding of what my body was trying to tell me and what I was going through. And I'll explain more of that later as we talk today. But our bodies are trying to tell us something when we go through stressful situations, and typically we ignore that. So I want to explain to you, just in a nutshell, what happens in your body when you go through a crisis, because it affects you. When you get into a crisis mode, when you're stressed, when one of those crises that I mentioned earlier happens to you, your mind and your body go into what we're calling crisis mode. And that's meant to help you get through the stressful situation. God has designed you that way to do that. That can become a problem for us, though, when we stay in crisis mode and when we don't manage our bodies well through the situation. So the first thing that happens when you are in a stressful crisis type event or anything stressful is your adrenal gland kicks in adrenaline and cortisol. Those are stress hormones. And what happens, they get into your system and they help you get through the situation. Meaning, if this were, 10,000 years ago and a bear is chasing you, boom, you're faster, you know how to get out of the situation, and you're saved. That's the idea of it. Today, though, we get kicked into stress mode when we open our email or when someone rings the doorbell or when we answer a phone, and that adrenaline kicks in. Over time, if we leave those hormones in our system, they can prematurely age us, they can ruin our sleep, they affect organ health, and a bunch of other things that really are negative for us if we leave them in our system too long. The second thing that happens when those hormones get kicked into your system is what we call tunnel vision. It's fast mind. The medical term is tachypsychia. It means that your mind speeds up. And this is where you're like everything went into slow-mo. It's because your mind has sped up because you now have adrenaline and cortisol in your system. When that happens, physiologically, you get tunnel vision. Your body literally restricts what you're seeing, and so you physically cannot see as much as you were when you were relaxed, when you were calm, when you were grounded, when you're not stressed out. The second thing, it actually distorts your hearing because the body is thinking, this is survival. I need to see to get out of the situation more than I need to hear. So it shuts off hearing. When you're driving in the car and you get lost and you start to get stressed, what's the first thing that you do? You start turning down the radio or asking everyone, please be quiet. It's because your hearing is compromised and you're trying to focus. And then the third thing that happens when you're experiencing this fast mind syndrome is your perception of time is altered. And I mentioned things seem like they slow down. So to recap that, this isn't everything. When that happens, when those hormones kick into your system in a crisis or when you're stressed, you are not seeing as clearly as you were before, you are not hearing as accurately as you were before, and you're not perceiving the events around you as accurately as you were before. You have to understand that. Now, when these hormones are kicked into your body, you enter into fight or flight. And there's actually 4 or more aspects to fight or flight, and they're right here. Fight, we understand that. You respond to the crisis fighting back. You want to attack it. You're wrong, I'm right. Flight is when you leave the situation. This is Elijah versus Jezebel in the Bible. He gets threatened by Jezebel. He bolts for over a month. We leave the situation. You divert so that you can get out of that situation. The next situation is called fawn, and fawn is where you try to please a person. So you're not being honest. You are feeling threatened, and the only way you can see to get out of the threatening situation is to give the person whatever they want and to please them. And then finally, freeze. That's another situation where you literally freeze, like a deer in the headlights. You don't know what to do. You don't know what to say. I'm not making fun of these. These are physiological reactions to how we perceive threat and how we deal with them around us. Irritability is one of the main ways you can tell if you've been in these situations for too long. Now, let me ask you, when was the last time someone asked you, are you irritable? Why are you irritable? You just ask yourself, when was the last time you just noticed you were kind of irritated? God did not design us to be irritable. So if you notice that you have been irritable, this is a sure sign that you are approaching burnout, but secondly, that you have been under a lot of stress for quite a while, and we need to manage it and take care of our body. This happens to us. It's like when your car is trying to tell you that it is overheating. Irritability is your body's way of saying, I am under too much of a load and I'm under too much stress, and essentially, I am overheating. So this is why we cannot ignore some of these signals that our body is sending us. If you're irritable, if you feel like you're constantly rushing, if you recognize things are moving in slow-mo, you're very, very stressed out. The hard thing, we often don't recognize when we have tunnel vision or when we're not hearing properly. And so we'll get into maybe a conflict conversation, like we're in conflict with somebody. It might be at work, it could be at home, it could be in the aisle of the grocery store. I don't know, anywhere you might get stressed, you have to remember, I am not seeing everything around me, and I have to work to get out of that. And secondly, I'm not hearing properly. My hearing is compromised. So as we face these situations, we desperately need support, but we are often unaware of it, and we often resist that support that people try to give to us. And have you considered, now that I'm sharing this with you, have you considered how living in a state like this might affect your relationships around you? If you're constantly irritable, if you're very stressed out, if you're not hearing properly, if you're not seeing everything that's going on around you, if your perception of time is altered, so you think something that's fast actually is slow and vice versa, how would that affect your relationships? That's going to be very difficult on the people around you. Now, let me move it one step further. How would living in this state impact your faith and your spiritual practices? Now, I can tell you, a lot of people would tell me during a crisis, oh, me and Jesus are great. But I just have to make this very clear. As someone who has walked through some very significant family and personal crises, and secondly, as someone who has walked with community people going through it, as a chaplain, and then also as a pastor in our church, it seems like there is almost always someone going through a crisis because that's life. I can just tell you right now, if you're not seeing properly and you're not hearing properly and your perception of time is altered, you're going to have a more difficult time perceiving what the Holy Spirit is saying to you. Now, that's hard for some of you to hear, but I need to make that very clear. That's the way God has designed us, because He wants us to be in community with our church. So let's just make that clear. There's nothing wrong with you. This is how we are affected when we walk through crisis. And I want to encourage you, when you go through crisis, first notice these signs within you, and second, reach out to those. Now, I'm going to give you practical steps later as we go, but these things, these crises, they affect us deeply. And if we don't know how to manage ourselves through them, we might actually cause more damage to ourselves and to our relationships. Biblically, we see people going through major, significant crisis often. Job loses all of his wealth, all of his children, and then his health, boom, boom, boom. And then his wife, she loses all of it too, and she's recorded as saying, just curse God and die. End it, because God's taken everything from us. Now, that wasn't necessarily the proper theological perspective, but I can understand where she's coming from. If I'm in her shoes and in Job's shoes, and all of a sudden these things happen, yeah, it looks like the divine is out to destroy me, even though that was not the case. And the moral of the story, is that God actually rewards their faith and faithfulness with twice what they lost. Now, does that mean that it didn't hurt? Absolutely not. He lost his health, he lost his 10 children, and he lost all the wealth that he had provided to provide security for his family. That was earned back. They did have more children. Obviously, his health came back, and he lived a very long time after that. But that is a significant crisis in the book of Job. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the book of Daniel, they were literally thrown into a furnace because of their faith, and they survived. The nation of Israel in the Old Testament was constantly under attack, and they were continually going through crisis. Oftentimes, crisis they brought on themselves because of their unfaithfulness to God. I'm not putting that on you today as to why you might be in crisis. Sometimes we believe this is our own doing. Sometimes it just comes at us. But the nation of Israel walked through significant crisis, even to a point where they broke apart kingdoms and they were each separately taken off into exile by other conquering nations. Jesus, on Friday before being the day of his crucifixion, sweat blood in the garden. That is some significant stress that our Savior felt physically. And then Paul, who's one of the most incredible people, and you read about him in the book of Acts, and then much of the Old Testament or the New Testament after that, Paul has given us. He writes in Acts 27, which we'll look at in a moment, about a shipwreck. He actually was in 4 shipwrecks in all of his life that we know of. He writes about 3 in 1 Corinthians, and then this one happens later. This is his 4th shipwreck. It was total survival mode. They're being tossed by this raging storm that's happening, that happens over a course of 2 weeks. They have to jettison everything over the side in order to survive. It literally is crisis mode and it's chaos. And in the scripture, in Acts 27, it says that they threw 4 anchors out the back. And so I want to give you 4 principles that we could call anchors, because these are 4 anchors that I want you to remember when you're going through a storm. Again, all of these are here in your little handout. You can write them, you can fill them in down here so you have these and you remember it. You could put it with your Bible or keep it someplace where you can refer back to it later when you're going through a stressful situation. But these are some things I want to offer to you that will help you when you're going through a crisis. So the first anchor, we find it in Acts 27:29, and it's the anchor of stability, and it hooks onto prayer. So in verse 27:29, this is after they are deep into this crisis. This storm has been going, like I said, for 2 weeks. Paul has told people before they left their last port, I see this ending badly. Please don't go. And they don't listen to him because he's a prisoner. And so here we are weeks later. They're in the middle of this chaos, and in verse 29, they had been dropping ropes to see how shallow the water was because it was dark, the storm was raging, they were afraid that they were going to run aground. And so verse 29, at this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors at the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Now, it's important to note that they did something physical in throwing the anchors out, and they did something spiritual in praying to God for daylight. Now, all of Paul's insights, if you read the entire chapter of Acts, all of his insights came from prayer. It came from time alone with God, sharing with God what he was seeing and listening to God for what God was saying to him. And I believe today that is still open and available to you. I believe you can pray to God and share, and you should share with him everything you're thinking and feeling and fearing. And I believe if you would listen, if you would quiet yourself, that the Holy Spirit would speak to you and would share insight to you. God doesn't tell you everything, but God talks to us. God wants to share with us. If we're not listening, if we're not praying, we're going to miss what God has to say for us. A consistent, vibrant prayer life is the bloodline of our faith. And when we get into a crisis, it can be easy to get into one extreme or another. The first extreme is we neglect prayer. We forget. We have tunnel vision. We forget that God is with us in this crisis as well. And so therefore, we just forget to pray. And in doing so, we cut off one of the most important ways God communicates with us. So that's one extreme. The second extreme is what I call full spiritual isolation, where it's like I cut off everyone around me, and it's just me praying to Jesus. And oftentimes we do that because we think we're embarrassed. We don't want people to know what we're experiencing, whatever it is. Or maybe there's some pride there. I can't trust you. You can't help me, whatever it is. The problem is when our vision is limited and our hearing is inaccurate and our perception of time is altered, so is our faith. You can't tell me that you have this vibrant, incredible, deep time of prayer with God when you're not seeing, hearing, or understanding accurately. And so that's why it's so important that we need prayer partners around us that we will listen to. A lot of people have people around them that they like, but that they don't listen to. And a lot of times we do that. We think I'm good because I'm in church. I'm good because I'm in even a group. But the reality is we're not listening to them. When they challenge us or they share something that we don't quite agree with, we don't grow from it. We dismiss it. So really, we're not listening to them. And we're limiting ourselves. We're deceiving ourselves into thinking we have a deeper spirituality than we have. I would say we need prayer partners that we listen to. And if you're not, I've said this already, but if you're not seeing, hearing, and perceiving accurately, how can you perceive spiritually accurately at the same time? I don't think you can. Not hearing God well is common when you enter immediately into a crisis. It's not forever, but it does happen. In 2007, for example, I was 28 years old, and I found out that I had cancer, a very rare, very aggressive type of blood cancer, type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I remember they put me in the hospital to run all these tests. And at this point, I had been in ministry for a number of years. My wife and I had been married for a few years. We had our son. My wife had just found out she was pregnant with our daughter. Everything was going the way I wanted it to. I was in a great ministry, and things looked great, and they were great. And then I got that diagnosis. And up until that moment, my relationship with God, I would say, was doing really well. It was pretty well thriving. And then I got into the hospital, and I was scared for my life. And literally, I remember wanting to pray and just struggling. And when people were there who'd offer to pray with me, I loved it because I didn't know what to say. It was like, God, I don't want to die. And that's all I had. So I remember it literally took a day and a half of being in this hospital room with a stranger I didn't know on the other side of the curtain, because it wasn't a single occupancy room. And it took a day and a half for the stress to calm down enough. And I was reading through my Bible, and I finally felt like it was the middle of the night. Finally, I was able to hear God because of all the stress. So when we get into a crisis, it's actually quite common for people to almost forget how to pray. And that's why we need people around us. If it weren't for the people who were there in my room those first day or two, it would have just been me, and I don't know how I would have managed it. Do you have someone around you that you regularly pray with and pray for? We need more prayer than we can pray for ourselves. That's a principle that I hope you'll write down. You need more prayer than you can pray for yourself, so you need to get it from others around you. And we need prayer partners that will pray deeper than just survival prayers, like I was able to pray in that moment. We need people who will pray thriving prayers. I honestly believe I'm here today on this video with you because other people prayed that I would live. And I think God acted because of some of their prayers and some of my prayers. What situations do you need prayer for that you might not be aware of how to pray? And so you need someone around you continually. We don't know when these crises come. They do not announce themselves until they're there. So therefore, we need to create relationships as soon as possible, deep, honest, authentic, prayer-centered relationships, so that when these moments happen, you've already been praying with one another for a long time. I have people in my life that are in this church. I have people in my life that aren't in our church, and I text with them, some of them weekly, some of them just as needed, some of them monthly. And the easiest way is to text and to phone call if they're not present with me. But it's taken me a long time to figure out that I need more prayer than I can pray for myself. And so I've needed to find and seek out people. And sometimes it takes a little while, but it's worth it. I would recommend that you do it. It can literally be as simple as sending a text or having a phone call. But who are you going to ask to be your prayer partner? I see people in this church praying for one another often, and I love it because it can't just be one person praying for us. It's got to be everyone praying for everyone. So I would invite you to reach out and ask someone, hey, would you mind praying with me like once a week? Or, what can I pray for you for? Here's some things you could pray for me for. That's how our faiths are built. The Bible says as iron sharpens iron, so one sharpens another, and that's how we do it spiritually. So that's the first anchor. It's the anchor of stability, and it hooks onto prayer. The second anchor that I want to offer to you, it's the anchor of unity, and it hooks onto our relationships. So you can see this in Acts 27, verse 30, and I think we have it right here for you. Then the sailors tried to abandon ship. I just want to pause. There's three groups of people on this ship. There's the sailors, there's the soldiers, and then there's the prisoners. Paul is a prisoner. He speaks to the soldiers because they're in charge of him, but the soldiers don't run the ship. The sailors are running the ship. So the sailors, they think, we're done. We've had it. We've prayed for daylight. Daylight's not coming. We're out of here. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer of the soldier and the soldiers, you will all die unless the sailors stay aboard. So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and they let it drift away. And this is huge because this insight that Paul got came from prayer. In prayer, God told him, everyone lives, or if one person gets away, the unity is broken and you guys won't survive. This speaks to the principle of community. I need, you need, we all need outside eyes to help us see and outside ears to help us hear what we're missing in these crisis moments. We need backup. We need a wingman. We need our crew around us. Community provides strength. And this is typically the first thing people jettison when they're in a crisis. We often treat the church like it's our local grocery store. And I'll go as long as they've got the product that I like. If they sing the song that I want to hear, if they look like this or do that, I'm good to go there. But if the price goes up or if this changes or if they paint the wall or whatever happens, I'm out. I'll go to the one down the street. And we have to, I would just say I understand that, but I disagree with that. We have to start seeing our church community as our lifeboat, as we have one another. The church is who we are. And sometimes we walk through this crisis and we need others or they need us. But if we treat it like I'm only here because it's convenient, we're not going to be the church and we won't accept the church around us. We won't really experience the church. And the truth is, you learn to navigate a crisis the same way you learn how to swim, essentially by being pushed into the water. And so we need people around us when we get pushed into the crisis. This is why it's so important not to go it alone. Don't do life alone. There are lots of ways in this church we try to aid people into creating relationships. Every single service you come to, we have a mingle right in the middle. It's so that people can meet one another. It literally is enough time for introductions. That's all it is. Make it your goal when you're at Hillcrest to just try to meet a new person every time you come. We have lunches once a month. It's not, I mean, the food is great, but it's not about the great food. It's because we want you to sit down and get to know one another. The food is an excuse. It's to entice you. You know, I grew up on a horse ranch, and you'd say you could lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Well, now I pastor a church, and truthfully, you can lead people to food, but you can't make them create relationships. So we will get you food. We just want you to create those relationships. If you want to go deeper, there's our roots groups that we periodically do throughout the year, where you get into a small group of people and you study some biblical concept in depth, and there's talking and there's listening and there's learning and there's praying and there's relationships created. And then also serving in crews in our church, our service crews, where kids crew, youth crew, our ministry crew, our worship crew, our hospitality crew. There's all these different crews where you can get involved in the church. You're on a team at that point. Honestly, I think this is the best way to create significant relationships because, for one thing, it's God-centered. You're doing something that benefits the church. You're doing it for God. But secondly, when you team up with people, it creates a different camaraderie. I'll never forget when I was in high school and I was paired up with this person to lead this ministry. We were put onto a ministry crew together and we worked quite well together. And then I realized, not only is this girl smoking hot, but I really like who she is too as a person. And later we dated, and now we've been married over 20 years. So I found my wife through being on a ministry crew. Totally did not expect that. Some of you've been praying that God would help you find that special someone. Maybe it's time that you join a ministry crew. I don't know. I'll just put that out there. The truth is, who is your community around you? Who is the people you have around you that you won't quit on and they won't quit on you? Those relationships are so important, and I would just say work hard to build those relationships here in your church community. The church is here to surround you, support you, and it needs you to do the same for others. Don't jettison the church when you go through a crisis. That's probably one of the worst things that you could do, and it's something that a lot of people do because that's what our culture does. I would say the biblical thing, if one of them jumped ship, they all were going to perish. And I would just say when you're going through a crisis, there sometimes is embarrassment. There's a lot of things that happen within us, but you need your church community around you. So don't jump ship. Stay aboard. That's the second anchor, the anchor of unity, which hooks onto relationship. Here's the third one. It's the anchor of renewal. And this one hooks onto self-care. Remember, things happen in your body that affect your mind and your soul when you are stressed and in a crisis. So we have to take care of our bodies. So, verse 33, just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your heads will perish. Then he took some bread and he gave thanks to God before all of them, and he broke it, and he broke off a piece and he ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and they began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. Now, this is them taking care of their bodies, which encouraged them. They needed that. They were depleted. Paul said, you've been worrying, you haven't eaten for 2 weeks. I mean, they've been not just not eating, they have been struggling, dealing with this crisis. And so here they are, they eat, they start to feel better because it's connected to our bodies. Here's the thing I've learned about self-care. We will either self-care or we will self-medicate. And so when I was going through grief, I found myself doing permissible Christian self-medications. I was living off coffee and caffeine. I was living off of like sour candy, and I was living off of like salty chips. None of that is good for you unless you want to gain weight and unless you want to ruin your sleep. And that's exactly what was happening. But those are comfort foods. I was trying so hard to comfort myself, and I just was comfort eating. And the problem was it wasn't good for me. And so I was self-medicating. I was scrolling all day long on my phone. I don't remember anything I saw. It was literally to numb my mind because I was just experiencing so much stress and pain from the grief that I was walking through. So I learned right away, we can quickly self-medicate. Even as a chaplain, there's times I've gone to one chaplain call and it's very sad, and then one time in particular, I remember getting called to another call, and it was an active CPR call at a store in the area. And so I saw this patient being worked on by 7 paramedics, and there's all these people in the store around just watching, and there was a lot of energy, and I'm trying to help people who are disturbed by what they're seeing, and the patient's being taken care of. I'm trying to help the firemen as much as possible. The person had to get shocked, and it was a lot like what you see on TV, and I realized I just saw this happen in real life. And so when the call was done, I got in my car, and it was as if I was on a high, not like, ooh, that was amazing, but like there was so much adrenaline in my system, I felt like I needed to run 10 miles. And so I got home and I immediately doubled up on dinner, and then I found myself like hours later, I could not come down. And so I found myself snacking in bed, which I don't do that. Like, it's not a usual thing, but what had happened is I had so much stress hormones in my body and I wasn't getting rid of them properly. So I have since learned, and being involved with the fire department, they've done so much work on this because their firemen are constantly getting calls and getting the stress hormones, and then you feel a crash, and all day long it's like this wave of stress and craziness. And so they've learned how to regulate it pretty well. So I'm going to share with you a few practical things you can do with your body so that when you are stressed, it'll help you regulate your physical body and your emotion and the crisis. You'll navigate it better. First, you have to pay attention to notice what your body's stress responses are. Like, are you irritable? Are your muscles tight? Are you clenching? Are you clenching your jaw? Are your fist balled up? Are you tight? Some of the things I mentioned earlier in the message. Pay attention. Then second, To regulate our body and our emotions, we need to prioritize sleep, which some of the things we do and some of the things we eat or drink aren't helping us sleep. So prioritize that. We need to have good nutrition, not junk food. And then we need some exercise. And then I would just say the first and foremost thing that I have learned is that water binds itself to the stress hormones and it will release it and take it out of your body. So if you recognize that you're stressed, go have a glass of water and then literally take some deep breaths. Do it for like a minute. And most of you have an iWatch, and so it has a breathing app on it. Literally, if you will do a controlled breathing where you breathe in for 4 and hold it for a count of 4 and breathe out for 4 and hold it for a count of 4, and you do that for a few minutes, that will actually lower your heart rate and it will reset the part of your body that's releasing stress hormones into your bloodstream so that they burn out quicker and so that you can become more calm. So literally, it is as simple as just breathing, drinking some water, and then later having good exercise, having good nutrition, then you'll be able to sleep. What'll happen if you practice things like that, the stress that used to hit you up here and then take you down here, it'll hit you, but not so high, and then your crash won't be so low. And you'll be able to more be you. Your tunnel vision won't be quite so tunnel vision. It'll be a little wider. You'll be able to hear a little better because you'll be slowing down. And I think I missed, help me understand what you were saying. It's so that you can navigate that a little bit better. Also, pay attention to some unhealthy stress management responses that you might have. Overeating or drinking or using substances, addictive or obsessive behaviors, unbridled retail therapy. That's where you're going into debt. I'm okay with buying something to make you feel better, but if you're going into debt to do it, that's going to be a problem for you. Pay attention to some of those responses because those actually create more problems for us down the road. And then I want to point something out that I noticed in this passage, and this is something that I've seen happen a million times, in ministry. Verse 33 says, just as day was dawning. Now, if you're in the middle of a storm at nighttime on the open sea, you can't see anything. But once you start to see daylight, you start to feel a little bit better. And remember, they had also prayed for daylight, the first verse I shared with you. So there's also this sense of like, okay, God is helping us. They're starting to feel better now. They've eaten a little bit. They can see a little better now because there's light popping up. And so I've noticed when we are in these crises that there is kind of a thing that happens when we find daybreak like this, when day starts to dawn. A little hint of daylight makes us feel like we're through the crisis, but we're really not through the crisis. For example, in this situation, they're going to run ashore, their ship is going to break apart, they're going to have to swim and make it all the way to shore, and then they're stuck on an island in the middle of winter somewhere in the Mediterranean. They have a long way to go before they are through this crisis. And there will come a time when you are in your crisis where you're just done. You've had it. You're tired of dealing with the crisis. You just want to go back to normal, whatever that is. You want to be out from under the stress. You want to bury your head in the sand. You don't want to get out of bed, whatever it is. And when that happens, when we get this feeling like, okay, we're through, even though we're not through, we're kind of deceiving ourselves when you get that momentary reprieve and you think, I'm through, I'm done, I'm never going to have it happen again. When we get that feeling, we might then recognize unconsciously, I have been hanging on to all this negative energy. And we might try to deflect that negative energy and emotion onto others. Again, I've seen this so many times. And so what happens when we're in that moment, we just start unleashing and unloading, and it's all unconscious. And so I would say to you right now, until the crisis is fully done, and even afterward, because these are negative things that often happen to us when we're in a crisis and we're overloaded with stress and problems and we don't know what to do with it, I would say avoid gossip. Oftentimes people gossip because they don't want to deal with their own stuff. It's easier to talk about Cheryl over here than it is to deal with the thing that I might have done or that I'm dealing with. And it's easier to talk about Daryl over there than it is and tell people about what his problems are because I don't want to tell anyone else about my problems. So avoid gossip. The next one, avoid blame shifting. Sometimes crises happen because we've done something or someone around us has done something that we wish they hadn't done. However, sometimes we just start blaming. Well, if this hadn't happened and that, if you hadn't done this or whatever, you understand what blame is. I would just say, remember, in a crisis, God will try to mature us, but that won't happen if we start shifting blame onto others. And so I would say a third piece of that is avoid piecing together narratives or assumptions about what others are thinking or what others are doing or what got you there in the first place. So here's what I've found. I've done this myself, and I see others doing it all the time in crisis. There's this narrative principle. And when a crisis happens, we naturally want to understand what's happening so that we can get through it. That's normal human behavior. However, remember, in a crisis, your sight is limited, your hearing is compromised, and your perception is altered. So we're not always going to get all the answers, and then we're coming from a place where we are very limited. And we try to craft a narrative that makes sense to us, but don't trust that narrative if it cannot be verified by actual facts. Because oftentimes we will start to engage in confirmation bias. Anything that sounds remotely like it agrees with our narrative, we hold on to. And anything that challenges our narrative, we fight, because we do not want to have anything challenge our narrative. So the action step is to connect back with your crew. Make sure you have people around you who are seeing and hearing and who are speaking truth to you and that you're receiving, and then connect with prayer. We want to make sure that you are praying through this so that you don't engage in toxic, negative, or sinful behavior simply because you are stressed out. And here is the final anchor that I want to share with you today when you're walking through crisis. This is the anchor of reality, and it hooks on to action. Look at verse 41 with me. But they hit a shoal, and they ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape, but the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore. And here's the point. There finally came a point where they had to take some action, and they had to swim. These people had to leave behind the safety of the ship that had gotten them this far, even though it was breaking apart. And sometimes we have to take actions when we go through a crisis that are uncomfortable. In fact, they seem scarier. It might seem like maybe if we stayed on this ship, we would experience rescue. But if we jump off of it, I will never make it in the open ocean. However, they all lived. So what actions do you need to take in a crisis? There are some things that you need to do when you're going through a crisis. Again, that's why we put this pamphlet together for you. That's why we have this whole talk together for you. We want to make sure that you navigate a crisis well and that we navigate it with you. So here's some things. Make yourself known, first and foremost. I've already mentioned this. Make yourself known to your crew, to your roots group. Make yourself known to your church. Do the old-fashioned thing. Come set a meeting with your pastor so I know who you are and I can help connect you with some of these other important things I've been talking about. Make yourself known. I can't read your mind. Nobody can. So we need you to tell us you're going through something difficult. The second one is make your crisis known. That's what I'm getting at. This is where you just say, I need help. You don't necessarily have to tell me or anyone anything. You just need to say, I need help. I promise you, if you say, I need help, people will be there for you. The third one is to make your needs known. Oftentimes, we don't recognize we have expectations. They're under the surface of our conscience, but we expect people to do things for us, and we don't always say them, especially when we're in crisis, because we're tunnel visioning on the crisis. We're not thinking about, I expect person A and person B and person C to do these things for me. We just can't articulate that. So that's why it's important when you make yourself known and you say, I need help, that then people can say, okay, what can I do? Now what they're doing is they're trying to address your expectations. And so you can say, oftentimes people will tell me, I just need prayer. That's fantastic. But what they're really saying is, I need you to pray X amount of time, X amount of days. I need you to reach out. I need you to do this. I need you to organize this. And so what's happening is we have a difference of expectation. It's going uncommunicated, and that can hurt you. And all I'm saying is make your needs known. When they come up, text someone, can you help me with this? No? Okay, I understand. Thank you. Do you know anyone who could? No? Okay, I'll find someone else. But now we're having a conversation, and now we're able to get somewhere. Make your needs known because they're a big part of the narratives we create in these crises. So make them clear and share them with grace. And what I mean by that, when you ask someone if they can help you meet your expectations, grace means sometimes they can't. They might also be in a crisis. They might be going through something difficult too that you don't know about. And so understand that people have lives and they want to help, but understand they might not be able to meet all your expectations because sometimes we have very high expectations. I mean, I want to be paraded through like my crisis with people around me lifting me up like I'm royalty, but that's not fair because no one's going to do that. Those expectations are unrealistic. So have the conversation about your expectations. And then finally, make the effort to go to others. And I would just say at Hillcrest, we want to try and we want to strive to be people where everybody sees it as their responsibility to help anyone else through a crisis like this. Meaning, if I know you're going through something, okay, I should go to you. And if you know you're going through something, okay, I should go to somebody else. All of us should be going to one another because we are the church community. We are the children of God. We're in this church together. And therefore, if you're going through something, say something. And if you see something going through something, say something so that we can be the church for one another. Thank you for listening to this talk today. I really hope that it's been helpful and beneficial for you. I just want to say a prayer for you because obviously if you watch this, it means something to you and you're possibly going through something. So if you don't mind, let me just say a word of prayer and then I hope you'll do the things that you've learned from this talk today. Jesus, thank you for whoever is watching. Thank you for the person you love that is going through a tough, stressful, difficult situation. And God, we know that you've designed us in a certain way to survive situations, but sometimes we get into survival mode in normal life. We get into survival mode when we go through stressful crisis situations and we need the help of others. And I pray that you would help us to understand where our sight or our hearing or our perceptions are altered and maybe rely on others for that. Lord, I pray the biggest thing that you would help us to do is to care for ourselves and to care for the community, to make ourselves and our needs known, and so that we could all help one another in navigating crisis. Thank you that you love us and that you love this church, and we just pray you would help us all in this. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you need any more help, please reach out to us here at Hillcrest, and we'll be happy to walk through that with you. God bless you.